You're sitting inside a longhouse in what is now southern Turkey, roughly 9,000 years ago. Smoke curls along a low mud brick ceiling, and the air smells like tallow and crushed barley. Outside, a negotiation is happening between two families, not shouted, not violent, just quiet, deliberate talk about who will marry whom, and whose land will be shared, and whose grandchildren will belong to which house. You don't speak the language, but you recognize the tone immediately. It's the sound of people trying to agree on something that affects a life. The only question is, whose agreement actually counted? So did ancient people even have the concept of consent? The easy answer is no, that prehistory was a lawless free-for-all where the strongest simply took what they wanted. But that answer collapses the moment you look at the actual archaeological and legal record. Some of the oldest written laws on Earth spend an enormous amount of ink defining exactly who was allowed to say no. The real story isn't the absence of consent. It's a slow, uneven, sometimes brutal argument over who was considered human enough to have it. Here's what nobody tells you. Consent wasn't invented in a courtroom or a modern classroom. It's one of the oldest legal concepts we have physical proof of. Carved into clay, baked into stone, thousands of years before anyone used the word consent at all. And the evidence for this is genuinely unsettling, because it shows a species that has always known the difference between yes and silence, and has spent most of its history deciding whose silence didn't matter. The earliest hard evidence doesn't come from a cave painting or a burial. It comes from law. Around 1754 BCE, King Hammurabi of Babylon had 282 laws carved into a 2.5-meter basalt pillar, now sitting in the Louvre. Buried among the property disputes and ox-goring penalties are laws about sex without agreement. Law 130 is explicit. If a man forces a betrothed virgin who still lives in her father's house and she had not consented, the man is put to death and the woman goes free, untouched by penalty. That single clause tells you two things at once. First, that Babylonian law recognized a category called without her consent. Second, that this recognition existed almost 3,800 years before your great-great-grandparents were born. Go back further, to Çatalhöyük, the 9,000-year-old proto-city excavated by archaeologist Ian Hodder's team starting in the 1990s. And the picture gets murkier, not clearer. Burial patterns there suggest houses were matrilineal or bilateral, with women buried with as much status and grave wealth as men. There's no wedding record, no dowry contract, nothing you could call a marriage license. Which means for the earliest large human settlements we've ever dug up, we genuinely don't know how a yes was communicated. Only that the social structure didn't automatically hand power to one sex over the other, the way later empires would. And here's the surprising context. It's not that ancient people lacked the moral vocabulary for consent. It's that the vocabulary shows up unevenly, tribe by tribe, empire by empire, and it almost always tracks something else entirely: property. So if the concept was there this early, what changed to make it disappear for some people and not others? The conventional story you'll hear is that early humans were sexually lawless, that consent is a modern invention layered onto a species that spent 300,000 years operating on pure force. Except the legal record doesn't quite work that way. Hammurabi's code didn't invent the concept of without consent. It codified something that was clearly already a live social issue. One requiring 282 laws to manage because people were already arguing about it constantly. What actually happened is stranger. Anthropologist Gerda Lerner, in her 1986 work on the origins of patriarchy, proposed that as agricultural societies formed and land became inheritable, women's reproductive choices got folded into property law. Not because early humans forgot the concept of a person's right to say no, but because settled agriculture created something hunter-gatherer bands rarely had: heritable wealth that needed a guaranteed bloodline. Suddenly, whose child was whose mattered economically in a way it hadn't before. And consent, instead of being a personal right, quietly became a transaction between men, fathers, husbands, brothers, with a woman's own voice legally relevant only insofar as it affected the deal. It's a wryly grim upgrade. Humanity's oldest legal writing wasn't protecting a person's autonomy so much as protecting a man's inventory. The stakes here aren't small. If this reframe holds, then what we call consent culture today isn't a modern invention layered onto ancient chaos. It's ancient personal autonomy, briefly nationalized by property law, that humanity has spent thousands of years trying to buy back. This isn't just a legal history question. It shows up in the biology of pair bonding itself. Primatologist Sarah Blaffer. Herdy's research throughout the 1990s and 2000s on maternal and mating behavior in primates found that female mate choice, the ability to select or reject a partner, is present across most primate species, humans included, and is evolutionarily expensive to suppress. Suppressing it requires constant social enforcement, guarding, seclusion, legal codes. In other words, restricting consent isn't the default setting of human mating behavior. It's a costly system that has to be actively built and maintained. Think of it like a dam. Water doesn't naturally want to sit still. It takes continuous structural effort to hold it in place. Female choice across our evolutionary history was the water, property law, seclusion practices, and honor codes with a dam. And here's the sentence to let sink in. For most of human evolutionary history, the natural state that later legal systems had to fight against wasn't chaos, it was choice. This tension shows up almost everywhere you look. Among the Mosuo people of southwestern China, a matrilineal society still practicing walking marriage today, women choose and change partners without needing family or male approval, a living counterexample to the idea that restriction is the human default. In classical Athens, by contrast, a woman's marriage was arranged entirely by her male guardian, her own preference legally irrelevant. And in bonobo troops, humanity's closest living relative alongside chimpanzees, primatologist, Frans de Waal's decades of field observation show females forming coalitions specifically to block unwanted male aggression. A kind of proto-consent enforcement with no legal system at all, just social cooperation. So here's the uncomfortable question. If the capacity for consent is this ancient, and the machinery for overriding it is this well-documented, what does it say about us that the override has usually won? For most of recorded history across most civilizations, the legal record isn't a record of consent being protected. It's a record of it being negotiated away, quietly, generation after generation, dressed up as tradition, honor, or family duty. The darkest part isn't that ancient people didn't know better. Hammurabi's own code proves they did. The darkest part is that knowing better has never been enough on its own. It has always required someone with power deciding to enforce it. And enforcement, historically, has been optional. The honest answer is, we don't fully know when the first human said no and had that no respected, the moment left no fossil, no burial good, no carbon date. We only have the paper trail of the fights that followed. But the next time you sign a form, click I agree, or simply say yes to something and expect that yes to matter. You're not participating in a modern courtesy. You're standing at the tail end of a 3,800-year-old argument that started on a basalt pillar in Babylon and still isn't finished. Consent, it turns out, isn't humanity's newest idea. It might be one of its oldest, just also one of its most fought over.